Last week we started in Daniel 7, but we had so much to cover we couldn't finish. Do you remember that? Daniel 7 has a lot going. Daniel 7 is kind of in the central part of the book. In fact, the chiastic structure of Daniel 7, or of Daniel, the book of Daniel, would suggest that the climax of the book is right here at the judgment in Daniel 7. You know, judgment is a big part of Daniel. You remember that the name Daniel means, what? Judgment of God, or God is judge, all right? Remember, Dan is judge. Remember the tribe of Dan? Do you remember what Dan's problem was, by the way? I'm wondering if maybe the term judge was connected to Dan because of the way Dan was. Or maybe his name was given to him and it already had that meaning. But you remember the tribe of Dan was the tribe that we don't find listed in the overcomers going into the city of God at the end of time. When we did our series on the tribes, you remember that Dan had this particular gift of being able to judge, to assess things and make judgments upon things. And some of us here, I should say some of you here, probably have that gift. I don't know if I have that gift. Often I wonder if I have the gift to make wise judgments. But the flip side of the positive aspect of being able to judge is what? What's the negative part of the person who is quick to see the answer? They become critical because they begin to put down other people's judgments as being inferior to theirs. Other people's opinions are inferior to theirs, and so they become critical. And that's what happened to Dan. You remember he was likened to the snake that would come up out of the desert sand and bite the heels of the horses as they went by. And Dan became very critical, and that was a major problem. So, Dan, judge. And the L ending, E-L, God. So we see this book is about the judgment of God. Is judgment a good thing? We'll talk more about that as we go along. We need to pick it up from where we left off last time. You remember we had looked at those 4 beasts that are here in Daniel 7. What was the first beast? A lion. What kind of a lion? What was different about this lion? He had wings to begin with. And then those wings were plucked off and he stood up. And what did he talk like? He had some human characteristics, didn't he? All right. Now, what was the second animal? A bear. Raised up on one side. And it had 3 ribs in its mouth, remember. This was a ravenous bear. This was a beast of prey. And, of course, we likened the first one to Babylon, the lion of Babylon, and the second one, the bear of Medo-Persia, the dual kingdom, with the Persian side being in the ascendancy. We'll see more about that when we get into the next vision in chapter 8. But remember, in Daniel, these prophecies are given, and as they are repeated in different symbols, there is more detail given, and often a particular, especially the end time, is more emphasized and dwelt upon. What was the third animal? A leopard. Something unusual about this leopard. A couple of things unusual about this leopard. This one would be in Ripley's Believe It or Not, wouldn't it? 4 wings on this leopard and 4 heads on this leopard. This is a strange leopard. But you remember as we look at the kingdom that came along after Medo-Persia, the Grecian kingdom, very quickly when it came into its ascendancy, you remember at the height of its power, Alexander died, and the power went to his 4 generals because he had not named a successor. We'll talk more about that when we get into the vision in Daniel 8. The 4th beast, what kind of a beast? Terrible beast. That's right. Well, it doesn't sound like any beast that we know of, right? That we would go even look at in the zoo today. Some people call it a nondescript beast. Some people call it a dragon. Some people think it's similar to the mixed up beast of Revelation that we could talk about if we went to Revelation, but that's not our subject today. So this was a terrible beast, and what was unusual about this beast? 10 horns. All right, that's a really unusual beast, isn't it? With 10 horns. That's a lot of horns. And? Okay, he had iron connected. Where was his iron? Teeth of iron. Teeth of iron. And what was the description of the beast? Remember, he was terrible, and he crushed, and he stomped, and he was strong, and he was destructive. All right. So let's back up now. We just reviewed the beast. Oh, there was one thing we forgot on the fourth beast. What happened to those 10 horns? Oh, 3 of the horns came out, and in their place came a little horn, but didn't stay little. Remember, it grew bigger and bigger, and this little horn had an unusual characteristic. What did he do? Okay, he had eyes, and there was another unusual characteristic. And he had a mouth. So he had 2 human characteristics, the eyes and the mouth. And he spoke like a human speaks. And he spoke pompous words, it says in verse 8 of Daniel 7. Okay, that's a little review of the vision. Now, let's look at what follows. By the way, you'll notice if you have a Bible that puts things in prose form or in poetry form, what do you notice about Daniel 7? Do you notice the differences in the sections there in Daniel 7? You'll have a section of prose, and then you have a section of poetry. What was the first section that we just talked about? Prose. And then now as we get into verse 9, what do we notice? Poetry. Then when we get down here into verse 11. Verse 11 and 12. Prose again. Verse 13 and 14 that we read, that Doug read for Scripture today. Poetry. Then notice when you get into verse 15, you're back into prose until verse 23, and you get back into poetry. And then there's a little bit of prose right at the very end. But there's mainly 3 prose sections and 3 poetry sections, and then that little capstone at the very end, that last verse. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that generally speaking, the prose sections are dealing with issues, with things that happen here on earth, and the poetry sections are taking us more to heavenly activities. I thought that was kind of interesting when I noted it. And so as we get into verse 9, we're switching from the earthly to the heavenly. Verse 9. I watched till thrones were put in place. I think King James says thrones were cast down. Put in place is a more appropriate translation here, I believe. The best I can study, the more I've looked, I think put in place captures it more succinctly. The thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days was seated. Now remember last time I mentioned to the children in particular this plural of thrones here. For some people they think that that's a plural of emphasis, which would suggest that this throne is a throne of all thrones. All right. Or what did we say last week? Anybody remember the term I used? I stole the term from Jacques Ducan. Super throne. Remember that? I can't believe the young people didn't remember that one. Were you asleep last week? All right. Anyway, this is a super throne. This is the throne of thrones. This is the throne of the Ancient of Days. All right? Remember, the Ancient of Days is unique to Daniel. Don't find it anywhere else in the Scriptures. The Ancient of Days. And the Ancient of Days was seated on this throne. And his garment was white as snow. What does that tell us? His clothes were white. What? Pure, good, righteous, white, and light throughout the Bible. There is no question. Throughout the Bible, they're synonymous with God's righteousness, with right doing, with purity and justice. That's why in Revelation 12, when it pictures God's church in the form of a woman, she's clothed with the sun, and she has the moon under her feet and stars on her head, and she's just immersed and dripping in light because she's righteous. She has the righteousness of Christ, you see. Well, the Ancient of Days is righteous. Aren't you glad that the Ancient of Days is righteous? Only the one who knows what truth and righteousness are fully is qualified to judge between right and wrong. All of my judgments are faulty because I have some mistaken notions. All of my decisions can be held up to question because I have incomplete knowledge. But God's judgments and knowledge and understanding are perfect and true. All right, so his garments are white as snow. And the hair on his head was like pure wool. Remember? Pure wool. Does that call into mind any text of Scripture? Come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. God wants to give us this same privilege. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Only He who is pure and righteous can truly forgive us our sins and make us righteous. His head was like pure wool. By the way, what else does white hair tell us besides righteousness? Oh, yes. You see, throughout the Bible, this, young people, this, and this. I could point to some others, but I better not. The snow on the roof, the white beard, those things in the Bible are symbols of age. We understand that. But in the Bible, it's all, young people, listen up. It's a symbol of wisdom. Let me tell you something. When I was a young upstart preacher, just getting started there in Paradise under Ed Koenig, I was privileged to spend 2 years in that wonderful church. And one of the delights of being there for 2 years, in that it was a large congregation. We had about 1,000 members. And one of the delights was we had a lot of retired people who had had rich experiences working for the Lord. Retired missionaries that had come back and retired in Paradise. People who had been missionaries in South America, people who had been missionaries over in Asia, just people who had been all over the world. We had retired college professors, we had retired pastors, we had retired people of all stripes, we had retired workmen of all kinds. And one of my delights was to get acquainted with these people and listen. I learned so much just by listening to these folk. It was a wonderful privilege. And I think that's what stood me in good stead when I went to my first church on my own. And I've told you, some of you remember the story of the man who was very critical there. He was an elderly man and I was a very young man. But the Lord had taught me some things, and through the Lord's grace it went well. White hair, wisdom. So God is wisdom. He is righteousness. We cannot find another in the universe that's wiser than the one who's going to be in charge of everything. Who is in charge of everything even now? We cannot find another in the universe that is more righteous. We cannot find another in the universe that is more loving. You know, many of you have heard me mention that my father was alcoholic during my lifetime, up until, well, he wasn't quite until he died, because he didn't drink the last several months of his life that I'm aware of. but I've never known whether it was by choice or because he could not get to it, because he was quite sick, dealing with cancer in its various forms, in particular bone cancer. And after my passing of my dad, I used to be very bothered. Why would I be bothered? Because I love my dad. And it's hard for me to think of spending an eternity without my dad. So it's my heart's desire and hope that he will be in God's kingdom. Do you have any relatives like that that have passed on? I would submit to you that if you were going to look, search the entire universe to the farthest galaxies, and you looked at every inhabited planet there is with all the noble beings that God has created, or if you searched this world over and you were to look for the person, the one being who is the wisest, who is the most loving and understanding, who is the fairest and most just of all, where would you go? We couldn't do any better than that which has been revealed to us is already in the plan. And so that has really helped to put my heart at ease. I hope it does yours. Notice now, finishing off verse 9, his throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. I mentioned last time that that's very much like the picture we get in Ezekiel. The wheels within the wheels and so on. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. By the way, fire and light, remember, is very much connected with God, but fire in particular is connected in the Scriptures with the destructive part of the judgment. Remember, there is a lake of fire to be thinking about. And we'll talk more about that. All right, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Have any of you youth ever done the math on that? Well, I don't think this is quite literal math, because the Apostle Paul says that it's an innumerable host. Even if I did the math here and tried to count that far, it would take me a long, long while. These are God's heavenly beings. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Now, where are we in the time of history when this court is seated and the books are opened? Do any of you remember what I said last time? What have we noted here so far? Where did we end in verse 8? This little horn power is still speaking pompous words as we enter into verse 9. When we pick up the story again in verse 11, this next section of prose, he says, I watched then because the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. So sandwiched in between during the time of the little horn power, while it's still doing its thing, while it's still speaking all its great words, the judgment of God is seated. You remember that the Bible tells us right there at the end of Revelation that when Christ comes, he comes and his reward is with him. How could that be? Oh, by the way, though, we're going to see that the Ancient of Days, he may be seated and he may be in charge of all, but he delegates as a good leader. We're going to see what he delegates. But first, let's read verse 11 and 12, and then we'll get back into the heavenly part again. We're going to jump back down to earth here and see, he says, I watched, Daniel still seeing, and he's watching. And then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, I watched till the beast was slain. So he watched the whole thing until its end, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. Now, some people have a hard time with verse 12, and let me just suggest my best understanding. As for the rest of the beast, remember the other three before? They had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. It seems to me that what's happening is this. Remember the other three beasts, if you look carefully and study all the prophecies and history, it's very clear that the impact of the previous empires carries on in the empires that take over. You remember, we can even see that in Daniel. As the Medo-Persians have taken over, we still see a lot of the Babylonian characteristics. The people weren't destroyed. Cyrus was a great leader, and some of the people in Babylon, I think, were relieved to have Cyrus become their king because he was such a great and kind man. Many peoples looked on Cyrus as their deliverer, even though he conquered their countries. And of course, we know that when Greece took over, did the Greek Empire and the Greek culture and Greek thought have any kind of impact at all on the Roman culture later on? Well, did it ever? What was the language of business during the Roman Empire time in the days of the New Testament when Jesus was here? In what language was the New Testament written? Greek. But the Romans were in charge, Jim. You see, these nations kind of lived on, and they didn't come to an utter end in many ways. He's going back in history to describe what took place with all these nations. But when this fourth beast is destroyed, this will be at the end of time, or very close to the end. And there will be no more carrying on in any other human nation or empire or kingdom. All right? Now let's jump back to verse 13 and look what happened in heaven while we were finishing off Daniel's description here of that horn. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man. Who is the Son of Man? Oh, for those of us who are Christians, we immediately think of Jesus because he used that term for himself more than 80 times in the New Testament. It was his favorite term for himself, the Son of Man. Why do you think? Why do you think Jesus used that term so often? That's what he was, all right? It's a fact. But there were a lot of other facts. He was also the Son of God. Yeah, for me, it just seems like he wanted to make sure I knew that he knew that he was one of us. All right? He wanted to make sure that I knew he's my brother, my elder brother. By the way, I have 2 older brothers, and that's a real privilege. It is a real privilege. And to have Christ as our elder brother, well, that's a privilege of all privileges. The Son of Man. The literal translation of this would simply be, well, the meaning of it, I should say, simply means a human being. All right? This is a human being. Coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, that sounds a little inconsistent here, doesn't it? A human being coming with the clouds of heaven. One like the Son of Man coming. And I think I might have given the illusion last time that maybe this is like the second coming, but this really isn't the second coming. It's very similar in language because we know he comes in the clouds, right? But where is he coming here? Let's read it. Coming with the clouds of heaven, and where did he come to? Did he come to the earth? No, he came to the Ancient of Days. And where is the Ancient of Days? Last we left the Ancient of Days, he's seated on the super throne. And the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven. Oh, I'd love to see that, wouldn't you? Wonder what kind of chariot that was. What kind of transport was that looked like the clouds of heaven? And they brought him near. It says he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. The Son of Man and the Ancient of Days come together. Then to him, the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. And all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Now, we've approached this idea about kingdoms lasting and not lasting several times in Daniel already, haven't we? Remember, Nebuchadnezzar came up against that head on, and he decided he was going to change what God had to say. Remember that? Built that big gold image. Remember, he had that vision that talked about that stone that was cut out of the mountain without human hand, that came down and smote the image on the feet and ground it to powder and destroyed all the human nations. And it was that kingdom that became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And what was it? What was that kingdom? This kingdom right here. The one that the Son of Man establishes. And that kingdom is given to him by the Ancient of Days. It is a heavenly doing, a heavenly event. Oh, by the way, does it make sense that there is some of the judgment and some of the dealing with sin that takes place in heaven itself? Where did sin begin? What's our textual reference for sin beginning in heaven? Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel, and just double the chapter, because it's the second occurrence, chapter 28. Isaiah 14, chapter 28 of Ezekiel. Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28. Get those in your mind, and you'll always be able to show people where sin started. And that God did not develop sin. God did not create or invent sin. That it came about within the heart of a perfect created being named Lucifer, the carrier of the light of God, who wanted to be like God. Even though God had given him so much, he did not have enough. And so it began in heaven, and Revelation 12 tells us there was war in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought, and the dragon and his angels fought. And the tail of the dragon, when he was cast out of heaven, drew how many of the stars of God, or the angels of God? 1/3 of the angels of God. So you put Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Revelation 12 together, and you have a fairly succinct picture about what happened, how sin started in heaven. And so, I believe it's only appropriate that a good section of the judgment against sin and the dragon and his angels and all sinners takes place in heaven. Some people call this the pre-Advent judgment. Some people call it the investigative judgment, which for me is more sense because of the activity that takes place. You see, well, I won't ask you if any of you have ever gone through a trial. But I've sat through some trials. And I've seen some trials where the people are convicted and some where they're exonerated. I like the ones where they're exonerated. What are the phases of a trial? Once it's been established that there should be a trial, that's after the hearing, then there is an investigation of the evidence, right? And there are arguments between the defense and the prosecution and so on, and they look at all the evidence. And then hopefully there's a jury there, or at least a very wise judge, listening to all this. And then there is the pronouncement of the verdict. And then what? It's not done yet. Then there's the part where finally the verdict is carried out. All right? Now, if God brings with him his reward, what must have happened prior? The evidence has been looked at. I don't believe it's because God needs to know that. See, I think God knows all that. God knew it all even before it happened, the way I read my Bible. So this evidence is something that I believe is for others' benefit, including you and me and God's entire universe. By the way, who's being judged in this judgment? All right. Not only are all the people being judged and all the angels. What? But in the process, it's revealing what God is like. And there is a judgment upon the judge himself. What kind of a judge he is. You know, there was a time when I had to settle a lawsuit because I inherited the lawsuit. Well, I inherited 3, actually. I remember one in particular, which took place in the courthouse in Marysville, California. And I remember how painful it was for me to go to this place. And it became painfully obvious to me after many times there that the judge and the attorney for the other side were well known to each other. And it was very clear that I was from Napa and not from Marysville. And I made a judgment upon that court as a result of my time in that court. And my judgment was that the judge was not impartial and that the whole thing was a farce. That was my opinion, and still my opinion today. But at my attorney's recommendation, I settled it and paid. Now, that was something I had inherited. I had nothing to do with what took place ahead of time. But I'm telling you that any time judgment is made, it says something about those who make the judgment. Do some of you have opinions about the jury that made a judgment in Southern California some many years ago on the same man that was just convicted in Las Vegas a little while ago on another charge? You've probably made certain judgments on those juries, haven't you? Judgment is made on God as well. Verse 15. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit. Oh, Daniel's seen all this. And it's impacted him greatly. And the visions of my head troubled me. And I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Those great beasts which are four kings, he says, which arise out of the earth. We've talked about that. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. So he's helping to reassure Daniel, in spite of all you see here, Daniel, all these troubles, all this persecution, and these fierce beasts that represent the political powers of this world that are going to trample upon the consciences of people and persecute his people. In spite of all that, and in spite of that other power, well, he's going to talk about that in a little bit, God is going to see that his people win in the end. And see, the neat thing about judgment is it exonerates those who have been mistreated. You see, I'm not looking for fairness in this world, to be honest. Oh, there are times I've been disappointed like I just described. But I don't really totally expect fairness in this world. James tells me that I should not get impatient and try to correct that myself. James tells me in his little letter that I need to be patient and put that in the hands of God. And so maybe I was at fault even describing that to you because I probably put a negative upon our judicial system, because there are many times I've seen the judicial system work very well. I saw a wonderful Christian nurse accused of adult abuse one time. And I knew this woman, and I knew her character. And I couldn't believe that this was possible. And I was just so pleased to see the judicial system work. And in spite of the fact that it was the state of California with much bigger resources and much more power and clout than this little Christian nurse, In spite of the fact they were going against her, the judicial system exonerated her and showed her to be innocent of all charges. And I was so excited. And I'm still excited when I think about it. And that happened 20 years or so ago. You see, God's people will be exonerated. Judgment is salvation. Do you remember what the saviors of Israel were called during that little period of time in between the inhabiting of the Canaan area by Israel and the time that they had their first king? What were their saviors called? Judges. Can you remember some of those judges? Samson, Jephthah, I heard. Deborah, remember? These were great heroes who saved their people, but they were called judges. You see, salvation is a great big part of God's judgment. In fact, it's the main part, I believe. And in order for salvation to be complete and total, in order for God's love for his people to be truly and fully worked out, he must deal with the issue of sin. He must get sin out of the universe. Otherwise, it's going to destroy his people. Ultimately, it would destroy his universe. All right, so judgment was made in favor of the saints, right? They received the kingdom. Then verse 19, I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze. We forgot to mention that, didn't we? I did. Which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. See, Daniel wanted to know about that. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and there before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. See, Daniel's worried about all this. Why? Because he knows that that little horn power is the major issue against God's people. And it's the most long-lived of all. In fact, in here it's described about how long it's going to have its ascendancy against God's people. Verse 21, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High. So now we see during the time of the little horn power, while that power is persecuting God's people, is when the Ancient of Days sits on his great big throne. And the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Now we go back to poetry in verse 23. The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it and break it in pieces. See, heaven is speaking to Daniel now. And the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. So we see that division of the legs of iron there into the clay and the iron, remember, down there on the image, is true again under the symbols of these beasts. And they're different from the first ones, and they subdue 3 kings. There shall arise after them one who is different. He shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High. How did the empire of Rome get broken up? We know this fourth great terrible beast is the empire of Rome. How did it get broken up? A lot of barbarians. We call them barbarians, don't we? These various tribes from all around the Roman Empire, in particular the northern part, came in and gave Rome all kinds of troubles. You remember that a Christian, quotes, Christian ruler of Rome decided to change his capital from Rome to another place. Do you remember what his name was? Constantine. And what did he call that new capital? Oh, of all things, Constantinople. Isn't that amazing? What happened to Rome? Who took over there? Well, you can go back and follow history and you'll find that somebody did take over there. And in the process, the one who took over there had a conflict with some of these barbarian tribes, in particular the ones who were called Aryans. Do you know what Aryan means? Aryan means a person who believes that Jesus had a beginning, that he was not divine in the sense of being everlasting, for sure. And so the Aryan tribes had great conflicts against the then ruler of Rome, who happened to be, of course, also a great bishop of the church, who didn't believe in these things. And in a sense, the bishop of Rome was right, I believe. But his methods were not right. And anyway, that power that's identified by the little horn power here finally uprooted 3 Aryan tribes over this issue. First, Clovis, the king of Franks, took care of the Visigoths, and then Justinian took care of the Vandals, and finally the Ostrogoths. And of all things, the Ostrogoths were finally pretty well decimated in the year 538 AD. Well, our time is up, and we still have 1,260 years to go. Let me just submit something to you. That here in verse 25, it tells not only about the details of descriptions of this power, it tells how long this power will have its ascendancy in its persecuting time against the people of God. How long is it in verse 25? A time and times. By the way, it's a dual plural. A time, a times, 2 times, and a half or a dividing of time, 3 1/2 times. And when we studied Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, what was the time? Remember, he was insane for 7 times or years. So here we have 3.5-year period. So you want to know more about that, don't you? Well, in Daniel 4, in that historical story about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar as king, they were literal years. But we're in prophecy. We're in symbolic area here in this particular chapter. So a year may be a year or maybe something else. It may be a symbol of something. So for you to really understand it, you need to go to Revelation 11, Revelation 12, and Revelation 13. This period is mentioned twice in Revelation 11, 2 and 3. It's mentioned twice in chapter 12, verses 6 and 14, and it's mentioned once in Revelation 13, verse 5. It's the most often repeated time prophecy in the Bible. And it's identified as 3.5 times, 1,260 days, and 42 months. And you do the math with a 30-day month, a Jewish or a Babylonian year of 360 days. You do the math of 3.5 years, 42 months, and you come up with the 1,260 days. So this is a time period that God did not want kept secret. And it started in 538. And what happened in 1798, 1,260 years later? General Berthier, under General Bonaparte, came in and captured Pius VI, took him away from Rome, and he died in captivity 1.5 years later. And the leader of the Roman state church state, whatever you want to say. Remember, we have a combination of political and religious here. And we see it, of course, in a horn that's a part of a beast giving the political part of the power, and the mouth and the eyes that are human characteristics giving the religious part of the power. We see that religio-political combo here in symbols in prophecy. Notice at the end of those 3.5 times, after 1798, verse 26, the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. Notice how that's repeated over and over. And all dominions shall serve and obey him. So he helps Daniel to see, yes, this is a power. We'll talk more about it when we get into Daniel 8, under some other symbols. But its symbol still remains a horn, which is an interesting thing, even though the animals change. Verse 28, this is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me. And my countenance changed, and I kept the matter in my heart. And he has to keep it in his heart now for 2 more years before God gives him another vision of chapter 8. So 2 years later, we'll look at next time we speak together, which will be 2 weeks from today. All right? What do we bring about out of today? Let me just say this. The judge is the best judge we could find. He's going to bring it all right in the end. And it's going to show that he is the best judge. He is the fairest. That his character can be represented by the white clothes. We're going to see that his wisdom can be represented by the gray hair. We're going to see that all his words are true and right. And in the process, those who will not accept his way have to finally be placed into a lake of fire. And those who accept his way, what about them? They're saved. They're exonerated. It's all made right. And they are a part of an everlasting kingdom which shall never be destroyed.